Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. And in this video I'm gonna share 4 tips on how to use on-camera flash creatively. On-camera flash can be your camera's built-in flash, or it can be a dedicated flash like this Godox Lux Junior. Very simple, inexpensive flash, and as a matter of fact, Godox sent this flash to me, and that's why I have to put the paid promotion label on the screen. But this is not a paid advertisement or anything like that. Just some tips on how to use on-camera flash and a few thoughts on this flash, whether it's worth it or not. But without any further small talk, here's my tip number 1. Use your on-camera flash as fill light and key light at the same time. On-camera flash creates very directional, harsh, hard light that is coming from your camera direction. But that can work really nicely, for example, for portraits. First, put your subject in the shade and choose a bright background, like in my case, sunny background. Then use your on-camera flash to illuminate your subject, your model. And that can work really well, as you can see in this picture. I think this turned out really nice, and the hard light works really well in this picture, in my opinion. There are 2 things, maybe 3 things that make this kind of a lighting arrangement work. First, put your model in the shade, and second, choose a bright background. Make sure there is at least 2 or 3 stops less light on your model than on the background. And then you have to expose for the background. Set your camera exposure so that the background looks good, and then use your on-camera flash to illuminate your model. Very simple, and the results can be really nice even though the light from the flash is very hard and harsh. Now, before I move to the next tip, I'm going to explain how to use manual flash. But if you know this already, please use the timestamps below and jump to the next tip. And if you're going to try any of the tips that I share in this video, I highly recommend that you use full manual settings on your camera and on your flash. But I'm only going to cover the basics because a full tutorial would take too long. But if you'd like me to make a full manual flash tutorial video, please do leave a comment down below, and if I get enough requests, I'm gonna do it. Whenever you use a flash to take a picture, you are essentially making 2 exposures in that one frame. You're going to make the ambient exposure that you can control with your camera, and then you're making the flash exposure that you can control with your flash, of course. And the balance of those 2 exposures will determine how the picture is going to look. There are probably several ways to do this, but in my opinion, the best way is to start with the ambient exposure. Set your camera all manual, ISO, shutter speed and aperture all manual, and then set the exposure, the ambient exposure, to your liking. Like for example, in this picture, I set my ambient exposure for the background, and as you can see, my model is almost black because there's no light on her. And then set your flash output manually so that your main subject looks good to you. If your main subject looks too bright, lower the flash output. And if your main subject looks too dark, increase the flash output. And do that until you get the right exposure on your main subject. But it's very important to understand that you do not touch your camera settings anymore at this point. You will only adjust the flash output. Except, of course, if the ambient light levels change, maybe the sun goes behind the clouds or something, then of course you have to re-evaluate the ambient exposure too. But if the light levels, if the ambient light levels stay the same, you do not touch the camera settings anymore once you get them right. You will only adjust the flash output to get that flash exposure right. This may seem a little bit complicated at first, But think about it and experiment a little, and you'll soon get the hang of it, and you can master manual flash soon. It's not difficult, but you have to remember this. You will control the ambient exposure with your camera, and you will control the flash exposure with your flash. Those two are two separate exposures, even though they together make the final picture. Oh yes, I almost forgot. There's one more thing that you have to understand, and that is the flash sync speed of your camera. So take a look at your camera manual and find out what is the shortest shutter speed that you can use with a flash. On this Fuji X-T30, for example, it's 1/180. That is very important, especially if you shoot outside in bright light, because that shutter speed pretty much dictates the other exposure values that you can use, the aperture and ISO. And now we're ready to move to the tip number 2. Combine sharp and blur in one picture. Any flash can very effectively freeze motion because the flash burst of light is so quick. And if you combine that with the long exposure, you can combine sharp and blur in one picture. And if you do it right, it can almost look like a double exposure. You can create the blur or motion part in the picture by moving your camera or making your subject or model move around. When you set your ambient exposure, use a relatively long shutter speed. Maybe 1/8 of a second or 1/4 of a second is a good starting point. Long enough so that you can get some motion blur in your picture. And set the ambient exposure so that it's about 1 stop under, a little bit too dark. And then set your flash output so that you get a good balance between sharp and blur. It can be a little bit of a trial and error at first, but now that you know the basic rules, it should not be too difficult. Just remember that you control the ambient light with your camera and you control the flash with your flash. I use this Godox Lux Junior flash for all my pictures in this video. This is a very simple, inexpensive, compact, lightweight flash for every camera. This has a manual and automatic exposure control, but this is not a TTL flash. This does not communicate with your camera. But I don't think it's a big downside, and the upside is, of course, that this works with every camera. I think this is a really nice, neat little flash that you can have in your bag all the time, or even on your camera pretty much all the time, because it's so lightweight and compact. And the retro design looks really gorgeous with this silver Fuji X-T30 camera body. The price for this is just under $70. I'll put the link down below just in case you got interested. It's an affiliate link, so if you use that, you're gonna support my channel at the same time. But now let's move to the tip number 3. Create ghosts. And this, of course, works best if you take portraits or you have someone to model for you. Select a relatively dark background and set your ambient exposure a little bit dark, maybe 1 stop under. And then set your flash output so that your model will be overexposed. In this picture, you can see some detail on my model's face, for example, but of course, if you increase the flash output, you can create completely white silhouettes in your pictures. Or if you use a little bit lower output, you can get some more detail on your model, of course. But I think it works the best if you overexpose so much that there is barely any detail on your model. This is a very simple tip and should be very easy to get satisfactory results. Once you get your flash exposure to your liking, then experiment with different poses, because in this one I think the outline or the silhouette of your model will very much determine how good the picture is going to look. Tip number 4. Create vintage looking portraits. Many family pictures in the 1970s and 80s were shot with an on-camera flash, and those pictures have a certain two-dimensional look in them because of the on-camera flash, and the light is coming from the camera direction. And you can create some cool vintage looking portraits if you use on-camera flash. In these pictures you should try to minimize the ambient exposure, make it as dark as possible, and use your flash as the key light or pretty much the only light source in the picture. When your flash is the only or dominant light source in the picture, you'll get the best two-dimensional vintage looking light in your pictures. Of course, there are many other ways to experiment and have fun with on-camera flash. I think on-camera flash is a little underappreciated these days because the light is kind of ugly, but you can turn it around and make it work for you. So experiment, have fun, because I think that's what photography is all about, at least in my opinion. And who knows, maybe you can create some amazing pictures while you're at it. If you enjoyed these little tips, please consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that if you don't live in Finland. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.